time for this to be really interactive, lively, etc. Because the fact of the matter is, everybody here has enormous expertise and brilliant theoretical and creative instincts to do what we must do, which is no matter what endeavor we pursue, whether it's a Palestinian, whether it's the African continent, the things that are happening there, whether it is the African American liberation struggles and processes here, etc. Whether it's about gender, ethnic, and all the rest of it, or the damn overthrow of capitalism already. The fact of the matter is that you really do have to be a media maven. And when I say be a media maven, it's easy. It's easy to criticize commercial and mass media. It's become harder to deal with, and we need to offer critique of liberal media, from the NPRs to the Rachel Maddows and so on. We can get into that later. But the fact of the matter is, more strategically, we have to make media, and we have to do it in such a way that comports with the new technologies and multi-platform systems to accommodate the listening patterns of different groups of people. And we also have to have the politics that really immerse more people from the community into making the kind of media that advocates for their various positions. So whether it's political prisoners or any one of the others, or whether it's about the issues of unmitigated poverty in this country and its deepening, our use of media, our control of the media, with our resources and our creativity is essential to propagate the issues that we care about, and I hope to begin to more collectively advocate for state power. But hey, we're at the left forum. Dr. Gerald Horne is, which ones are you up to now? Is it 40 books? Más o menos. Each one
coming out next week.
Brilliantly documented. It restores our history. And for those of us who need to be, it not only restores a history, but it educates, particularly of those who have been brought up on a kind of Anglo-European analysis of the world community. And Dr. Horne's books are a must-read. I think he is one of the most brilliant researchers, astute historians, and champion of revolutionary processes melding race and class. Is it race or is it class? What is it? It's both. It's both. So there's many other things to say, but I feel that we are really privileged, as with all of you, to have Dr. Gerald Horne, who's going to take us into this discussion, and another privileged, wonderful woman has just opened the door, Dr. Betty Davis. But Dr. Gerald Horne.
Okay. Should I sit here or work out? Sit here?
Whatever you feel comfortable.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me. First of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm going to try to be brief. The theme of this weekend is towards a new strategy for the left, and one of the points I'm going to stress in my few minutes before you is that in order to have a new strategy, we may need a new conception. We may need a new conception of this nation, of this subcontinent. We may need a new understanding of how and why it is that here we are sitting in what was once Dutch territory, and before that was indigenous territory, and how it came to be that we're speaking this language developed in Northwest Europe in order to understand ourselves. And it seems to me that the left in particular should draw reasonable inferences from uncontested facts. What I mean is, you've had this spate of incidents recently, be it the Starbucks in Philadelphia, or the barbecuing while black incident in Oakland, or the Milwaukee Bucks basketball player tased, or the arrest, or I should say, the calling of the police on a black Yale graduate student after she was studying, not to mention the host of police killings, punctuated, as you know, in Staten Island by the killing of Eric Garner. And as with the debate over the U.S. attack on Vietnam some decades ago, we need to ask the question that was animating our struggles at that point. That is to say, was the war in Vietnam somewhat anomalous or accidental, or did it grow organically from a certain society and a certain socioeconomic structure? And likewise, with regard to these incidents that I've just talked about that implicate racism and white supremacy, we should ask ourselves, are these incidents contrary to who we are? That's not how we are, as you oftentimes hear the saying. Or does this flow organically from a certain history, a certain culture, and a certain society? And if it's the latter, then what do we do about it? That links to a second issue. Like many of you, I have to say I've been captivated by this idea that the anti-Trump faction of the U.S. ruling elite is talking more and more about fascism nowadays. That is to say, how Trump represents a very unique form of fascism. Look at Madeleine Albright, the former Secretary of State under Clinton, her book, Fascism, A Warning. The recent collection edited by Cass Sunstein, a former Obama administration official, now professor at Harvard Law School, the spouse of Samantha Power, former Obama ambassador to the United Nations. Can It Happen Here? A play on the 1930s novel, It Can Happen Here, about the rise of fascism in North America. Or the late novelist Philip Roth of Newark, New Jersey, and his novel, The Plot Against America, or one of the first persons to ring the alarm about Trump as fascism was Michael Kinsley, who actually economically is part of the 1% insofar as he's related by marriage to an heir to the Microsoft fortune, but raised an early alarm, late 2016, about Trump as fascist. But what's striking about these anti-Trump elements in the U.S. ruling elite is that, number one, they don't seem to recognize, and this is particularly egregious in the case of Philip Roth of Newark, that in a country based upon genocide and mass enslavement of Africans, it should not be surprising or shocking that at a certain point in its history, it could tip into fascism. I mean, that should not be considered anomalous or accidental, or as they say, that's not who we are. And secondly, a country whose foreign policy has been repeatedly involved in helping to engineer fascist coups, such as in Chile in September 11, 1973, or in backing of apartheid South Africa until it made its tactical retreat in the spring of 1994, it should not be surprising that such a country would have within it the seeds of fascism. And what's even more striking about these kinds of trends in literature is that at some times the liberal elite is to the left of those who consider themselves to be radical. And that's one of the problems that we have today. I mean, for example, if you look at the understanding of how this settler colony came to be, well, many of the liberal, if you look at the prize-winning book, The Common Cause by Robert Parkinson, the common cause being the common cause of the settlers revolting against London in the 18th century was mass dispossession of the Native Americans and enslavement of the Africans. Now, of course, liberals are still, like biologists who are still using early 1950s textbooks before the unraveling of DNA, they're still talking about this, North America as this religious refuge and liberty and freedom and all the rest. And it seems like the liberals are moving on. Or if you look at the book by Harvard Law School professor Michael Klarman, The Framers' Coup, where you have our progressive and radicals, they oftentimes are celebrating the Constitution on the one hand, although lamenting the Second Amendment, which obviously is based upon having citizen militias to suppress rebellions of Native Americans and Africans. And they're lamenting the Electoral College, which, as you know, is based upon giving power and weight to slave states. Whereas Michael Klarman, the Harvard law professor, is, he's going all the way live. He's talking about a coup that those who came to the Constitutional Convention pulled off, which has left us with this antiquated, archaic document that we're still operating under, that then allows, as you know, for a person who does not win the majority of the votes to prevail in an election. One of the lessons I would like to impart, and I know I'm preaching to the converted to a certain extent, is that those who consider themselves to be radical have to step up their game. Because it's unsustainable to have a project in a country where the liberals are to the left of the radicals. That doesn't make any sense. We can't go on like this. That's point number one. And in terms of stepping up our game, it seems to me that if you look at the broad sweep of U.S. history, it's clear that if you go back to London in 1688, the so-called Glorious Revolution that clips the wings of the monarch, that's driven by the desire of the the merchants to get in on the lucrative nature of the African slave trade, one of the most profitable enterprises known to humankind, oftentimes generating 1,700% profits at a time when you know that there are those today who would sell their firstborn for a 1,700% profit. Or 1776, they overthrow British rule in North America, leading to this present so-called republic, driven in no small measure by the fact that London and Somerset's case in June 1772 had moved to abolish slavery in England, and there was a fear that this decision would leapfrog the Atlantic, thereby jeopardizing fortunes in North America. And then the Royal Proclamation of 1763, London had moved to try to restrain the settlers from moving further west, so London would have to expend blood and treasure fighting the indigenous population, thereby jeopardizing the fortune of real estate speculator number one, George Washington. And this confluence leads to, of course, the revolt against British rule, which of course leads to the United States, the supposed fount of freedom and liberty, then moving to oust London from captaining the international slave trade, dominating the market of enslaved to Cuba by the 1790s, dominating the market, the biggest market in Brazil by the 1840s. And then what helps to generate a general crisis of the entire slave system, of course, is the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, which causes a general crisis of the system that could only be resolved with its collapse, forcing London to move away from its cash cow in Jamaica and abolishing the slave trade by 1807, slavery by 1833, and then the Haitian revolutionary government helping to work with the British abolitionists, putting pressure on North America. And then, of course, we know 1836, you have another secession, Texas seceding from Mexico, because Mexico had seceded from the Texas had seceded from Mexico in the 1820s, had abolished slavery under a president of African descent, Vicente Guerrero. And rather than go along with that particular decision, Stephen F. Austin, Sam Houston, and the people who the leading cities in Texas are now named for, seceded from Mexico in 1836, and shortly thereafter, their slave ships with the Lone Star flag could be found sailing into Cuba, off the coast of Brazil, off the coast of West Africa. But the Haitian revolutionaries and the British abolitionists put so much pressure on slave-owning Texas that it crawled into the Union, the U.S. Federation, by 1845, where it has been ever since, even though, of course, as you know, there's been talk of another Texas secession in the 21st century. And then, of course, the secession finally in 1861, which fortunately collapsed. But one of the lessons we draw from this, of course, is the importance of lengthening the battlefield, the importance of international solidarity. But for international solidarity, a person like myself, perhaps yourself, would still be sold on the open market, so to speak. And once again, I know I'm preaching to the converted to a certain extent, but one of the lessons that I would like to leave with you is that but for international solidarity, this country would be in more dire straits than it is today, and that if we are to dig ourselves out of this hole that we now find ourselves, it might be useful to pay attention to that lesson And that leads to the kind of coverage that not only Pacifica needs to engage in, but the Real News needs to engage in, and other media outlets that tend to be progressive. And that is a combination of being hyper-local and hyper-global. That is to say that in New York City, that would mean careful and close attention to the immigrant populations, the Haitian population, the West African population, 116th Street, the Dominican population in Washington Heights, the Mexican population, which is growing by leaps and bounds since it's the largest Spanish-speaking country in the world, which then brings us, of course, to the Mexican election, which takes place in a few weeks, where a left-wing candidate is now leading in the polls. And if that proves out, that will be a very significant development for us and our struggles. And so, once again, this combination of hyper-local and hyper-global, it seems to me, is the way to go going forward. Now, I sort of skipped ahead to my conclusion, so let me go back to the history to fill in some of the blanks. Just two more historical points. One, in terms of the U.S., one of the reasons we're in such a deep hole, and one of the reasons why the right wing is so strong in this country, is not only because the revolt against British rule was a settlers' revolt, and like the settlers' revolt in Algeria in the late 1950s, early 1960s, or the revolt in what is now Zimbabwe, then Rhodesia in 1965, settlers' revolts are inherently problematic. And certainly this settlers' revolt here in North America that proved to be successful, unlike those other two, has been proven to be problematic. And so what that means is that before the U.S. Civil War, there were basically three ideological factions in terms of Euro-American public opinion. You had an a radical faction symbolized by John Brown, but it was a minority faction, to be fair, even though, fortunately, there are streets in Haiti named after John Brown, and he is celebrated, understandably and justifiably, but it represents a certain kind of minority faction. And then secondly, you have a pro-slavery faction that triumphed in North America in 1776 and in Texas in 1836, and then finally failed with Jefferson Davis in 1861. And then you've had what many of our historians, including some in this city, I'm afraid, have mischaracterized as anti-slavery. But they were anti-slavery because they wanted to get rid of the Negroes altogether. They wanted to get rid of slavery and the Negroes. But some of our historian friends in the city and metropolitan area, they only focus on the first part, anti-slavery, and sort of mumble when it gets to the second part, get rid of the Negroes altogether. And that's why when Oregon was admitted into the Union in the 1850s, there was no Negroes allowed. One of the reasons our Portland still has one of the smallest black populations amongst major U.S. cities. Abraham Lincoln, for a good deal of his career, was part of this white man's country faction, as I term it. And then when he began to move away from it, because having to pass the Emancipation Proclamation in order to defeat the Confederates during the U.S. Civil War, this outraged sentiment, in which it led to his murder. But then the white man's country faction triumphed, and then after a brief experiment with Reconstruction, then began to impose Jim Crow laws, creating. This is after a failed deportation effort to carry through on this getting rid of the Negroes altogether. That failed in part, as I say in my book on Brazil, because nobody would take us. And so they were so fortunately you could say they didn't just line us up and shoot us. They decided to impose Jim Crow laws, which creates a kind of internal exile and creates these white spaces. And so when you go back to the incidents I began with Philadelphia Starbucks and Yale and barbecuing while black in Oakland, it's basically you're sort of violating these white spaces, and therefore have to be sanctioned despite the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which supposedly guaranteed our entry into these otherwise white spaces. But you can pass a law, but if there's not this sentiment that has been transformed, you're going to get incidents like barbecuing while black, Philadelphia Starbucks, etc. So once again, it seems to me we need a reconceptualization of the country in which we now find ourselves, if we really want to have a new strategy. Which brings me to my second point, which is the agonizing retreat from the more egregious elements of Jim Crow in the 1950s, which once again comes not least due to international pressure, the desire of Washington to point the finger of accusation at the socialist camp with regard to human rights violations, but how could they do that credibly when you have apartheid here? And then there's trying to appeal to national liberation movements, Ghana coming to independence in 1957, for example, Jamaica circa 1962, and it becomes very difficult to appeal to this emerging bloc in the United Nations and this national community as long as you have apartheid here, even though, as I pointed out, there was this compromise that the State Department was talking about by having so-called foreign blacks wear a button so that they could gain entry into restaurants and hotels, et cetera, that we domestic blacks would be excluded from. But obviously that did not work out very well. So, but then it leads to these mass revolts, because once again you're going against the dominant faction, the white man's country faction. Oh, okay. And so you have a revolt in Arkansas in the light of the desegregation of Central High School in 1957. Eisenhower has to bring federal troops into the cafeteria to keep the young Negro students from being mauled. Revolt in Oxford, Mississippi, because of desegregation of University of Mississippi. Once again, people getting shot and mauled. To show it wasn't sectional, revolt in Boston over school desegregation in the 1970s. In your neighborhood in Yonkers in the 1980s, mass revolt against housing desegregation. Represented, some of you might have seen the fictionalized version, Show Me a Hero. Anybody see that?
No.
Yeah, it's interesting. You should see it. And so now, of course, we're faced with the situation where, as the dominant faction sees it, international pressure has eased, and so they can revert to the historic norm of creating these all-white spaces and then crushing any of us who wander into these spaces, which brings us once again to WBAI Rising and the necessity for bringing historical context to these kinds of incidents that seem to be random in Oakland, in Philadelphia, et That's how we, it seems to me, comply with our obligation, our political obligation, by bringing historical context to these incidents that appear to be random. And then second of all, trying to reignite our international alliances. And Mr. Trump is helping us by alienating Mexico, alienating Canada, alienating the European Union with these tariffs. Sorry?
Shithole countries.
Oh, yes, yes. Alienating Africa and the Caribbean with these barnyard epithets that he casually tosses out to describe them. And so there is a potential for this kind of global alliance, and this brings us to this network, which can be heard all over the world, which has representatives from virtually every country we want to appeal to within walking distance, or at least a subway ride. And so this underscores the importance, the absolute importance of Pacifica, of WBAI, not to mention the people in this room. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
As I said, a national treasure. But you see, the reason we wanted Dr. Horne to go first is because this is our ideological sway and sensitivity. This is what we want to do. We know that it is imperative to take the historic voices of revolution and the most reliable forces of forced struggle, to get rid of the whitewash that historically leaves out the Afro perspective, and that's the entire African diaspora. And of course, we'll get to the next perspective as well. So what has this all got to do with WBAI Rising? It's got to do with who do we want to reach and what are the politics? And then we will get to the issue also of how does that become practical? What is it we're actually trying to accomplish to rejuvenate and make this precious 60-year-old station relevant to the causes of social justice, the evolution and taking of, yes, people's power, state power, and so on. So we want to be grounded, and if we're not grounded historically, and it's just a hodgepodge of odds and ends, then we don't use the media in a way that is really going to embed itself in the hearts and minds of the people and help provide both the informational and theoretical base to make us better agents for social change. So with that, again, I thank Dr. Horne, and I want to, it just seems to be a natural flow, if I may, talking about settlers and colonization and so on. One of the wonderful additions to me personally to learn from, and I think to our station, WBAI, and most definitely to BAI Rising, which is to take our voice further, and we'll talk about how, is Brother John Kane, who I think has an incredibly important project on the station, and I think it's more of a project per se than a program, and I am really honored that we bring my wonderful brother, John Kane, John Kane.
Well, I feel like I've got to add just, you did leave out the two Mohawk boys who were thrown out of a college tour at the Colorado State University, which is, again, more of those white spaces being violated by people of color. I am Mohawk, but I sometimes cringe when I say that word because that's not our word either. I'm Gunya Gahaga, it means the people of the land of Flint. But more importantly, I am Ungwe Umwe. And I know that always picks up Michael G. Haskins in the back of the room. He's one of the few guys who was able to pick up on that word almost immediately. And Ongwe is our word for, lack of a better word, I guess, native. It is our word for what is distinct about being a people who are always from here. The word means real human being. And the reason it distinguishes us as real human beings is because we have that vector back since the beginning of time, and we also have a vector forward because we don't plan on going anywhere. That wasn't always anybody else's plan, because we were also on that chopping block for people that they wanted to get rid of. Not that they wanted to ship us anywhere besides in the ground. We had our population eliminated by some estimates to the tune of 95 to 98% of our population was eliminated. And it wasn't just because we couldn't handle catching a cold. That myth that somehow we had weakened immune systems. You know, the one thing I will say, when I saw the miniseries of John Adams, it showed you just how unhealthy the white people looked. I mean,